Welcome to Liturgy of Slaves. The story we're sharing today uncovers a truth.
We gather
that
here
stayed
today
buried
to
for
honor
more
our
than
lost.
200 years. She was purchased for one reason alone: to carry children who would then be sold away. But what she quietly did to her owner's bloodline was never supposed to come to light. This is a heavy story, a disturbing one. So pause for a moment, take a breath, and listen closely. Before we begin,
We gather here today to honor our lost.
subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us the city and country you're listening from. Your voice helps make sure these stories are preserved, not erased. Now let's begin. 2. In the summer of 2019, a 67-year-old woman named Margaret Whitmore Collins sat inside a private medical office in Boston, Massachusetts. She had built her entire life on certainty. She came from one of the oldest families in the American South, a family whose ancestors had once controlled thousands of acres of land, built banks, laid railroad tracks, and erected textile mills. For nearly 2 centuries, the Whitmore name had carried weight. It meant power, wealth, legacy. But on that July afternoon, everything Margaret had ever believed about her family was about to come apart. The doctor set a folder on the desk between them. No smile, no small talk, just 4 words. The results came back. He explained that a rare hereditary condition had been found, one affecting every living member of the Whitmore bloodline, a genetic anomaly, progressive organ failure. It had appeared in her grandfather. It had killed her father at 58. It had taken her brother at 61. And now those same markers were present in her DNA, in her children's DNA, and in her grandchildren's. The doctor said something else. 2. Something that stopped her cold. This condition didn't follow normal inheritance patterns. It seemed to have entered the family sometime in the 19th century. And rather than fading with each generation, it had only grown stronger. He had never seen anything like it. Margaret asked if there was a treatment. He paused before answering. They could manage the symptoms, he said, but they could not cure what was already written into her blood. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her study, surrounded by painted portraits of her ancestors. She looked at the face of Edmund Whitmore, her great-great-grandfather, the man who had built the family fortune on the back of a cotton plantation in South Carolina. She studied his cold eyes, his tight, unfeeling mouth, and for the very first time in her life, she found herself wondering what secrets that face was hiding. She made a decision. She would hire a genealogist. She needed to trace this curse back to its source. She needed to understand why her family was dying. What she uncovered over the next 18 months would reach back 182 years, to a small wooden cabin on a plantation called Magnolia, to a 17-year-old girl named Ruth who had been purchased for a single purpose, and to a revenge so patient, so complete, so quietly devastating that it had waited nearly 2 centuries to finally be understood. This is that story. 2. The year was 1842. The place was Charleston, South Carolina, one of the wealthiest cities in all of America. And the source of that wealth was cotton. And the source of that cotton was the forced labor of enslaved people. By 1842, South Carolina held more enslaved people than free citizens. The economy, the culture, the entire social order, all of it depended on slavery continuing. Not just surviving, but thriving. In the heart of Charleston stood a building that tourists today walk past without ever knowing what happened inside its walls. It was called Ryan's Mart, one of the largest slave auction houses in the entire American South. High ceilings, wide windows to let in the light, hard brick floors, walls thick enough to swallow the sounds coming from within. Every Tuesday and Friday, enslaved people were brought to Ryan's Mart to be sold. They were made to stand on raised platforms, while buyers examined them like animals. Men had their teeth inspected. Women had their bodies scrutinized for signs of childbearing. Children were stripped from their mother's arms and sold off to strangers heading in different directions. The records from Ryan's Mart still exist today, kept in archives at universities and historical societies across the South. And in those records, in the faded ink of an auctioneer's ledger dated September 14, 1842, there is a single entry as Ruth, female, healthy, suitable for breeding, for she was sold for $420 to a man named Edmund Whitmore. Edmund Whitmore was 34 years old in 1842. He owned Magnolia Plantation, located about 40 miles northwest of Charleston. The property stretched across 200 acres. Most of that land was given over to cotton, ginned near the main house, and shipped down the Santee River to Charleston for export. Edmund had inherited Magnolia from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The Whitmores had been in South Carolina since before the Revolution. They saw themselves as aristocrats, the natural rulers of the land and everything on it. But Edmund had a problem, a practical problem. The international slave trade had been banned since 1808. Importing enslaved people from Africa or the Caribbean was now illegal. That meant the only way to grow the enslaved population was through birth, and birth required women. Women who could produce children. This practice had a name. It was called breeding. Plantation owners carefully selected women for their ability to bear children. Those children would either be put to work on the plantation or sold to other slaveholders for profit. A healthy child could fetch anywhere from $200 to $500. A woman who produced several children could generate thousands of dollars over the course of her lifetime. Edmund Whitmore was a practical man. He understood numbers. And when he saw Ruth standing on that platform in Charleston, he saw an investment. Ruth had been born on a small farm in Virginia in 1825. Her mother, a woman named Abena, had been taken from the Gold Coast of Africa as a child. By the time she was 20, Abena had been sold 3 times and had lost 2 children before Ruth was born. She knew exactly what awaited her daughter. She knew this world offered no protection, no mercy, and no second chances. But Abena carried something inside her that no one could auction away. She carried knowledge. Her own mother had been a healer in their village, a woman who understood the hidden properties of plants, the secrets of roots, the power of leaves and bark. This knowledge had moved from mother to daughter through generations of women, and Abena poured every last drop of it into Ruth. From the time Ruth was old enough to walk, her mother walked her through the fields and the forests, pointing and whispering. She taught Ruth which leaves could break a fever, which roots could ease the pain of childbirth, which berries could bring deep sleep, and which could stop a heart if given in the wrong amount. Abena made her daughter memorize everything. She told Ruth again and again, "Knowledge is the only thing they can never take from you." Ruth was 12 years old when her mother was sold to a buyer from Georgia. They never saw each other again, but Ruth kept everything her mother had taught her locked inside her mind. A treasure hidden so deep that no one could find it, let alone take it. For the next 5 years, Ruth worked on a tobacco farm in Virginia. She was quiet, obedient. She did what she was told. She never talked back, never caused trouble, and never, not once, let anyone see what she was truly thinking. In September of 1842, the tobacco farm was sold. All of its enslaved people were transported to Charleston to be auctioned. Ruth stood on the platform at Ryan's Mart and watched the white faces staring up at her, discussing her body like she was a horse or a piece of furniture. She watched Edmund Whitmore raise his hand. She didn't know it then, but she had just met the man whose bloodline she would destroy. Magnolia Plantation sat at the end of a long road lined with oak trees. The main house rose 2 stories high, with white columns and wide, shaded porches. Behind it stood the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the dairy, and the workshops. And further back, past the gardens and the stables, were the slave quarters. A row of small wooden cabins with dirt floors and no windows. Ruth arrived at Magnolia in late September of 1842. She was taken directly to a cabin at the end of the row and told it would be her home. 1 room, a rope and straw bed, a fireplace that didn't work properly, a roof that let in the rain, walls that let in the cold. But Ruth was not expected to spend much time in her cabin. Within 2 weeks of arriving, she was summoned to the main house. Edmund Whitmore's wife, a thin, pale woman named Constance, was present when Ruth walked in. Constance kept her eyes fixed on the floor, while her husband explained what was expected. Edmund said that Ruth had been purchased for a specific purpose. She was young, she was healthy, she would bear children. Those children would belong to him, to do with as he saw fit. She would receive adequate food and shelter, as long as she remained productive. If she caused trouble, or failed to conceive, she would be sold further south, to the cotton fields of Mississippi or Louisiana, where life expectancy for enslaved people was measured in years, not decades. Ruth stood in silence and listened to every word. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply looked at him and said, "Yes, sir." That night, Edmund Whitmore came to her cabin. Over the next 7 years, Ruth gave birth to 5 children. The first was a boy born in the summer of 1843. Edmund named him Samuel. Then came Mary in 1844, Thomas in 1846, Sarah in 1847, and Joseph in 1849. Ruth nursed each of her children. She held them. She sang to them in the language her mother had taught her. Words from a homeland she had never seen, but carried deep inside her blood. She loved them with a fierce, burning love that she kept hidden from everyone around her. But she also knew the truth. None of them would stay. Samuel was sold at age 7 to a plantation in Alabama. Mary was sold at 6 to a household in Savannah. Thomas, Sarah, and Joseph followed, one by one. Each time, Ruth watched her child being led away in chains, and each time, something inside her, something soft, turned to stone. Edmund Whitmore kept meticulous records of these transactions. They still exist in the Whitmore family papers, donated to the South Carolina Historical Society in 1952. They show that Edmund earned a total of $2,800 from the sale of Ruth's children. He considered it an excellent return on his investment. What those records do not show is what Ruth was thinking during those 7 years. They don't show the plans quietly forming behind her still eyes. They don't show the anger building like pressure in a sealed room. But there was another set of records that Edmund knew nothing about. Ruth was keeping her own account, not on paper, but in her memory. And in that account, a debt was growing, a debt that would take generations to repay. In the spring of 1850, something shifted at Magnolia Plantation. Constance Whitmore had been sick for years. Doctors called it female complaints, a polite way of admitting they had no idea what was wrong with her. She spent most of her days confined to her bedroom, taking laudanum for the pain, rotating through a series of physicians who prescribed cures that never worked. But in March of 1850, Constance's condition suddenly, remarkably improved. She began eating again. She came out of her room. She even walked in the gardens for the first time in 2 years. The cause: a tea that Ruth had quietly begun preparing for her. Ruth had gone to Esther, the older woman who ran the house kitchen, and suggested she knew a remedy that might help the mistress. Esther was skeptical, but she had watched Ruth closely over the years, and she trusted her. The tea was brought to Constance. Within hours, the pain had eased. From that day forward, Ruth prepared a special tea for Constance every single morning. Soon she was preparing tonics for others, too. A digestive remedy for Edmund's elderly mother. A sleep aid for Edmund himself, who complained of restlessness. Strengthening drinks for the Whitmore children. Edmund's 3 legitimate sons, the ones who would one day inherit everything. The entire household came to rely on Ruth's remedies. They trusted her completely. They called her Good Ruth, and remarked to one another how fortunate they were to have such a gifted woman in their possession. Not one of them thought to ask what was in their cups. Not one of them questioned why Ruth had suddenly become so devoted to helping the family that had stolen her children. Ruth never told them. She simply smiled, bowed her head, and kept preparing her specialties. Beauty. The knowledge that Abena had passed down to her daughter included far more than healing. It also held the darker side of that education. Information about plants that could cause harm, substances that could quietly weaken the body over time, leaving no obvious traces, no sudden collapses, no clear evidence. Among the plants growing wild in the Carolina Lowcountry was pokeweed. In small amounts, it could be used as a remedy. In larger amounts, administered slowly, carefully over extended periods, it could cause lasting damage to the blood and the internal organs. There was also bloodroot, and other plants whose names Ruth knew only in her mother's language. Plants that had been used in Africa for purposes that were never written down, but passed from mother to daughter through centuries of quiet, careful knowledge. Ruth never used enough of any single substance to trigger immediate illness. She was far too careful for that. She used amounts so small they would go completely undetected. Combinations so subtle that no physician would ever identify them. She adjusted everything by feel and observation, watching the family closely, reading their responses, recalibrating her recipes with each passing season. The effects would not appear right away. They would take years to surface. And even then, they would look like natural illness. The kind of weakness that runs quietly through a family, generation after generation, until one day someone thinks to ask why. But Ruth already knew why. She knew precisely what she was doing. She was not trying to kill Edmund Whitmore quickly. She was not trying to poison Constance or the children in any way that would draw attention or bring punishment crashing down on her. She was doing something far more devastating. She was planting seeds of ruin inside their bloodline. Slow-moving alterations, inherited weaknesses, compounding quietly with each new generation, until the Whitmore family, in the fullness of time, would simply cease to exist. Her children had been sold like livestock. The Whitmore children would either have no children of their own, or the ones they did have would be fragile, sickly, and short-lived. The family that had built its fortune on her suffering would pay with the only thing they truly cared about: their legacy. Ruth was patient. She had learned patience in the fields and the auction houses and the cabin where Edmund Whitmore came to her at night. She knew she would not live to see her revenge completed. She accepted that. She understood it in her bones. Some debts, she knew, take generations to collect. She was willing to wait, till by 1855. The effects of Ruth's quiet work had begun to surface, though no one connected them to her. Edmund's eldest son, William, had always been strong and healthy, but in his late teens, he began experiencing unexplained fatigue and bleeding. Doctors came from Charleston, even from as far as Philadelphia. They examined him carefully and called it a blood disorder of unknown origin. Rest, they said. Iron supplements. He would likely recover. William did not recover. He died in 1857, 2 months after his 21st birthday. Edmund's second son, Charles, showed the same signs in his early 20s. He managed to marry and father 2 daughters before his body began to fail. He died in 1863, not from any wound of war. He simply collapsed one day and never woke up. The third son, Henry, lived the longest. He survived the Civil War. He even managed Magnolia during the grueling years of Reconstruction. But he never married. He never had children. He told people he had no interest in family life. Those who knew him well said he was afraid. He had watched his brothers die, and he did not want to pass whatever curse they carried into another generation. Henry Whitmore died in 1889, alone, in the house where he had been born. With his death, the direct male line of Edmund Whitmore came to an end. But the blood didn't disappear entirely. Charles's two daughters had married and carried the Whitmore genetics into new families. And the damage Ruth had seeded moved with them, manifesting in different ways across different generations. But always present, always waiting, like a slow and patient fire that refused to go out. Ruth herself lived until 1881. She was 66 years old at the time of her death. An unusually long life for someone who had spent their youth in bondage. She witnessed the end of slavery in 1865. She witnessed the fragile hope of Reconstruction, when black men could vote, hold office, own land. And she witnessed that hope being violently crushed as white Southerners reasserted control through terror and new legislation. After the war, Ruth left Magnolia Plantation and settled in a small community of freed people near Charleston. She worked as a healer, using the knowledge her mother had given her to tend to her neighbors. She delivered babies. She treated fevers. She sat with the dying and held their hands as they passed. She never remarried. She never had more children. And for years, she searched for the 5 children who had been taken from her. She found 2 of them, Samuel and Sarah, who had survived both slavery and the war. She held them again. She held her grandchildren, but she never told anyone what she had done to the Whitmore family. She carried that secret deep inside her. A private victory, a quiet triumph that belonged to her and no one else. Until, a few weeks before she died, she called her granddaughter to her bedside. The girl's name was Patience. She was 16 years old. Ruth told her everything. She told her about the cabin at Magnolia, about her children being led away in chains, about the teas and the tonics, the slow revenge she had planted in the Whitmore blood. Deliberate, precise, and utterly invisible. And she told Patience to write it all down, so that someday, when the Whitmore family finally understood what had happened to them, someone in this world would already know the truth. Patience wrote the story in a small leather notebook, in English, the only language she knew. But she hid the book well, because she understood just how dangerous such a document could be. Patience kept that notebook her entire life. When she died in 1921, she passed it to her daughter. Her daughter passed it to hers. The notebook moved through generations, always hidden, always protected, waiting for its moment. The Whitmore family, meanwhile, continued its slow and quiet decline. Charles's descendants, scattered across the South and eventually the North. They changed their names through marriage. They built new lives in new cities. They had no idea they were carrying Ruth's legacy in their blood. But the effects kept coming. Premature deaths, unexplained illnesses, couples who tried for years to have children and never could. The pattern was there, for anyone who cared to look, but no one looked. The connections between distant cousins were too faint, the family too scattered, the original cause buried too far in the past. By the 20th century, the Whitmore name had nearly vanished from history. The plantation called Magnolia had been sold, divided, and sold again. The main house burned to the ground in 1911 and was never rebuilt. The slave cabins were demolished. Only the family papers survived, donated to the Historical Society by a descendant who had no idea what secrets they contained. And Ruth's notebook waited. passed from hand to hand through generations. It waited for the day when it would finally be read by someone who would understand. That day came in 2020. Margaret Whitmore Collins had hired a genealogist named David Okonkwo, a professor of African American history at Howard University who specialized in using genetic databases and historical records to reconnect families torn apart by slavery. He was exactly the kind of person who might find the connections that others had missed. David started with the standard sources: census records, property transfers, birth and death certificates, military records. He traced the Whitmore bloodline back through generations, documenting the pattern Margaret had described: the unusual concentration of illness and early death that seemed to follow the family like a shadow. But when he reached the 19th century, he found something he didn't expect. He found records of enslaved people at Magnolia Plantation, bills of sale, auction ledgers, plantation inventories, and in those records, the name Ruth. David Cross referenced the information with genetic databases built from DNA samples submitted by people searching for their ancestry. He found matches. He found descendants. And when he contacted those descendants, one of them told him about a notebook that had been passed down through her family for over a century. The notebook arrived at David's office in a cardboard box wrapped in old cloth. It was no bigger than a man's hand. A cracked, faded leather cover, fragile yellowed pages inside, covered in handwriting that took patience to read. David spent 3 weeks carefully transcribing it. When he finished, he sat alone in his office for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Margaret Whitmore Collins. He told her he had found the answer she was looking for. He told her she should sit down. Margaret flew to Washington the following week and met David in his office at Howard University. He handed her a copy of the transcription and watched her face as she read. The notebook began with a simple, devastating sentence. My grandmother's name was Ruth. She was bought for breeding in 1842. This is what she did. What followed was everything: the teas, the tonics, the slow and careful poisoning, the deliberate unraveling of the Whitmore bloodline. It explained everything that Margaret's doctors had never been able to understand. And, at the end of the notebook, written in a different hand, added years later by someone else, was a single line. She said they sold her children, so she made sure their children would end. She said some debts take a long time to pay. Margaret read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at David. She asked if it was real. She asked if what the notebook described was even possible. David said he had consulted with medical historians and geneticists. He explained that while the specific mechanisms Ruth described weren't scientifically precise, the underlying principle was entirely sound. Certain toxic substances, heavy metals, plant alkaloids, could cause genetic damage that persisted across generations. Scientists now called it epigenetic modification, and it was a phenomenon researchers were only beginning to fully understand. Ruth may not have known the science, David said, but she understood the practice. Her mother had taught her techniques, developed over generations in West Africa, techniques for influencing health and reproduction that European medicine would not discover for another century and a half. Then David paused. There was one more thing Margaret needed to know. Ruth's living descendants had been traced through the genetic databases, and one of them had agreed to meet with Margaret. If she wanted, Margaret said yes, without hesitation. Yes. 2. The meeting took place 2 weeks later in Charleston, South Carolina, in a hotel conference room overlooking the very harbor where slave ships had once unloaded their human cargo. Margaret arrived first. She sat at the table with her hands folded in front of her. She had spent 2 full weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing speeches about reconciliation, about understanding. She had practiced apologies. She had prepared herself. But when the door opened and Ruth's descendant walked in, every word Margaret had rehearsed simply disappeared. The woman's name was Grace Williams. She was 71 years old. She had gray hair, dark skin, and eyes that seemed to look straight through whatever they settled on. She was a retired schoolteacher from Atlanta who had spent her career teaching Black history to children who had never been told the truth about their past. Grace sat down across from Margaret. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Grace reached into her bag and placed the original notebook on the table between them. She said her family had held onto it for nearly 140 years. They had always known what it contained, but they had never known what to do with it. Some relatives had wanted to destroy it. Some had wanted to publish it. Most had simply wanted to keep it hidden and let the past stay buried. But Grace had made a different choice. She had decided the truth needed to be told, not for revenge, but for understanding. Ruth's story was a piece of American history, she said. A piece that had been deliberately erased and forgotten. Bringing it to light was a way of honoring Ruth's memory, and the memory of every woman like her who had suffered and resisted, and somehow survived. Grace pushed the notebook across the table toward Margaret. She said she wanted Margaret to have it. She said it belonged to both of their families now. Ruth's revenge was complete, and holding on to anger would not change what had already been done. Margaret picked up the notebook. She held it carefully, feeling the weight of 2 centuries pressing against her palms. She asked Grace if she was angry. She asked if she blamed her, Margaret, for what Edmund Whitmore had done. Grace was quiet for a long time before she answered. She said that anger was a fire that burned the person who carried it. Ruth had carried hers for 40 years, and it had consumed her life just as surely as it had consumed the Whitmores. Both families, Grace said, had been prisoners of the same history, trapped by choices made long before any of them were born. But then she said something else. She said that understanding was not the same as forgiveness. What Edmund Whitmore had done, what the entire system of slavery had done, was unforgivable. It could not be erased. It could not be made right by any act of reconciliation. The only thing they could do was acknowledge it, learn from it, and make absolutely certain it was never forgotten. Margaret nodded. She understood, too. She asked Grace what Ruth would have wanted. If she could somehow see the two of them sitting here together. Grace smiled for the first time since she had walked through the door. She said Ruth would have wanted to be remembered. She would have wanted people to know her name, to know her story. She would have wanted the world to understand that enslaved people were never passive victims. They resisted. They fought back in whatever ways they could. And sometimes, their resistance outlasted the very people who had tried to destroy them. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she had made her decision. She would make sure Ruth's story was told. She would donate the notebook to a museum. She would fund research into the Whitmore plantation records. She would do everything within her power to ensure that Ruth's name would never be forgotten. Grace reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. She held it for one quiet moment. 2 old women, joined by a history neither of them had chosen, but neither of them could escape. Then Grace stood up, gathered her things, and walked out of the room without looking back. Margaret sat alone for a long time after that, holding the notebook, watching the sun slowly set over Charleston Harbor. After her meeting with Grace, Margaret returned to Boston and began the work she had promised to do. She opened the Whitmore family papers to researchers for the first time. She funded a project to digitize plantation records from across the South Carolina Low Country. She contacted historians, archivists, and museum curators one by one. But she also began a more personal investigation. She needed to understand not just what Ruth had done, but how. How had a 17-year-old girl, with no formal education and no freedom, possessed knowledge sophisticated enough to alter the genetic destiny of an entire family? The answer would take her far beyond South Carolina, back across the Atlantic to the coast of West Africa, to a tradition of knowledge so carefully preserved that it had crossed the Middle Passage and continued quietly shaping American history in ways that most people had never recognized. Ruth's mother, Abena, had been born around 1800 in what is now modern Ghana. She came from a community where women held specific roles as healers and herbalists. This was not superstition or folk tradition. These were trained practitioners. Women who understood the properties of hundreds of different substances, who knew how to prepare medicines that acted immediately and others that worked slowly over months and years, who knew how to combine ingredients to produce effects that no single plant could achieve alone. When Abena was captured and forced onto a slave ship around 1810, she brought all of that knowledge with her. It was invisible to the traders who examined her body for signs of strength. It was invisible to the plantation owners who purchased her. But it was the most valuable thing she possessed. And she gave every last piece of it to Ruth. The specific methods Ruth used at Magnolia Plantation were later reconstructed by researchers who studied her notebook alongside historical records of African medicinal practice. Ruth's primary tool was a combination of plant-based compounds now classified as mutagens, substances capable of inducing changes to DNA. The most significant was a preparation derived from pokeweed, a plant native to the eastern United States, but closely related to species used in West African healing traditions. Pokeweed contains chemicals that affect how cells divide and reproduce. In small doses, they can stimulate the immune system. In larger doses, administered slowly, steadily, over long periods of time, they produce cumulative cellular damage that is passed from parent to child through what scientists now call epigenetic modification. Ruth combined pokeweed with bloodroot and preparations made from fungi growing in the damp corners of plantation buildings. She adjusted her mixtures based on what she observed, always careful, always precise, increasing or decreasing concentrations to achieve the effects she wanted while attracting no suspicion. The true genius of what Ruth did was its gradualism. She never caused sudden illness. She created an accumulation, slow, invisible, compounding, that would only become apparent years or decades later. By the time the Whitmore family began dying, Ruth would long be beyond suspicion. She was simply the quiet woman who made the morning tea. Medical historians who reviewed the Whitmore family records found patterns entirely consistent with this method. The deaths in the family bore the signatures of cumulative toxic exposure, combined with inherited genetic damage. The specific combination of symptoms, bleeding disorders, organ failure, reproductive problems, matched precisely what would be expected from the substances Ruth described in her notebook. A geneticist at Duke University, Dr. Sarah Mensah, spent 3 years studying the case. Her conclusion was striking. Ruth had essentially invented a form of genetic warfare. More than a century before the science existed to explain what she was doing. She didn't understand the mechanisms of DNA. She didn't need to. She understood the Tsar's effects. She knew that what damaged the parents would be reflected in the children, and she used that knowledge with devastating, unrelenting precision. Dr. Mensah published her findings in a medical journal in 2022. The article attracted significant attention. for both its scientific implications and its historical significance. It was proof that enslaved Africans had brought sophisticated, deeply developed medical knowledge to America, knowledge that had been dismissed and forgotten by a society that refused to recognize their humanity or their intelligence. But Ruth's story was not only a story of revenge. It was a story of survival, of resistance, and of the unbreakable bond between a mother and the children taken from her arms. After meeting Grace Williams, Margaret Whitmore Collins became consumed with finding Ruth's lost children. She hired investigators and genealogists. She searched through auction records and slave manifests. She submitted DNA samples to every database that would accept them. The search took 4 years. Most of it led nowhere. The records from the Antebellum South were incomplete, often deliberately destroyed. Many enslaved people had been listed by first name only, impossible to trace. Others had been sold multiple times, their trails swallowed by the chaos of the interstate slave trade. But in 2024, Margaret's team found a lead. In a ledger from Ryan's Mart dated 1849, they discovered the sale of a 6-year-old boy named Joseph, sold to a plantation in Mississippi for $275. The buyer's name was Cornelius Drake. The Drake plantation had been located near Natchez, Mississippi. And unlike many plantation owners, the Drake family had kept unusually detailed records. Births, deaths, family relationships. Those records had survived and were preserved by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Joseph was in those records. He had arrived at the Drake plantation in the fall of 1849. He had survived childhood, which many enslaved children did not. He had grown to adulthood, married a woman named Dina in 1865, just months after the end of the Civil War, and together they had raised 7 children. His descendants now numbered in the hundreds. And through the genetic databases of the 21st century, those descendants could be found. Margaret located them, scattered across the country, from Mississippi to California to New York. She contacted them one by one, explaining who she was and what she had discovered. Most had never heard the name Ruth. Most had never heard of Magnolia Plantation. They knew only that their ancestors had been enslaved somewhere in the South. When Margaret told them Ruth's story, when she told them they were the descendants of a woman who had struck back against her oppressors in a way that had never been recorded in any history book, the reactions were different for everyone. Some were proud. Some were shocked. Some were angry that the truth had taken this long to surface. But all of them wanted to know more. Among Joseph's great-great-grandchildren was a woman named Rosalind Carter, a retired nurse, 73 years old, living in Oakland, California. She had spent her career working in community health clinics, serving the people that the mainstream medical system most often overlooked. When Margaret reached her and told her Ruth's story, Rosalind began to cry. She said everything suddenly made sense. Her grandmother, Joseph's granddaughter, had been a healer in their community in rural Mississippi. She had known plants and remedies that no one else understood. She had delivered babies, treated illnesses, and helped people die with grace and dignity. And she had always said her knowledge came from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers, who had learned it from Africa. The knowledge that Abena had passed to Ruth had not died with Ruth. It had survived through Joseph, through his children and grandchildren, through generations of women who had quietly preserved what they had been given, the same tradition that had given Ruth the power to destroy the Whitmore bloodline had given her descendants the power to heal. Rosalind still had her grandmother's notebooks, filled with recipes and preparations passed down through the family. When researchers examined them, they found remarkable parallels to the substances in Ruth's own notebook. The knowledge had evolved. It had adapted, but its origins in West African medicine were unmistakable. Dr. Mensah, already deep in her research on Ruth's methods, became intensely interested in Rosalind's notebooks as well. She applied for grants, brought in ethnobotanists and medical historians, and began building a picture of a tradition of African American folk medicine that had never been properly studied or even properly seen. The work is ongoing. It has already produced important findings about plant-based compounds with potential modern medical applications. But more than that, it has demonstrated something that should have been obvious all along. The knowledge enslaved Africans carried to America was not lost. It was preserved, passed down through generations of people who refused, quietly and stubbornly, to let it die. As Ruth's story moved beyond academic journals and into public consciousness, it drew reactions from across the spectrum. For many African Americans, Ruth became a symbol of resistance. Her story was proof that enslaved people had never simply endured their bondage in silence. They had fought back, in ways both visible and invisible, using whatever tools they had. Ruth had no weapons, no army, no political power. She had only her knowledge and her patience. And with those two things, she had brought down a dynasty. Churches began telling her story during Black History Month. Artists painted her. Musicians wrote songs about her. A playwright in Chicago created a stage production based on her life that toured regional theaters across the Midwest. But the story also drew criticism. Some historians questioned whether Ruth's methods could truly have produced the effects described, arguing that the science of epigenetics was still poorly understood and that the claims being made were exaggerated or impossible. Others suggested the Whitmore family's decline might simply have been caused by an ordinary genetic disorder with no connection to Ruth at all. Others raised moral objections. They argued that celebrating Ruth's revenge was dangerous, that poisoning people was wrong regardless of the circumstances that surrounded it. They worried that holding Ruth up as a hero might blur important lines or encourage vigilante thinking. These debates played out in academic journals, newspaper opinion pages, and social media. They reflected deeper, unresolved disagreements about how to understand American history, how to assign moral responsibility for the crimes of the past, and how to honor people who had been denied the right to tell their own stories. Margaret Whitmore Collins followed all of it closely. In an interview with a Boston newspaper in 2023, she said that learning Ruth's story had been the most important experience of her life. It had forced her to understand that history was not something that happened long ago to other people. It lived in bodies and bloodlines and family traditions. The choices her ancestors had made were still shaping the present, still shaping her. She said she did not blame Ruth for what she had done. She said Ruth had been placed in an impossible situation and had responded with the only weapons available to her. And if the Whitmore family was cursed, she said quietly, they had brought that curse upon themselves. The Margaret died in 2025 at the age of 73, taken by the same genetic disorder that had claimed so many before her. In her will, she left the bulk of her estate to a foundation dedicated to researching the history of slavery in South Carolina and supporting the descendants of a people who had been enslaved on Whitmore land. The foundation was named after Ruth, too. The cabin where Ruth had lived at Magnolia Plantation no longer stands. It was demolished sometime in the early 20th century when the slave quarters were cleared to make room for tenant farming operations that have long since been abandoned. But the site itself can still be found, about 40 miles northwest of Charleston, on land now owned and managed by the state of South Carolina as a historical preserve. In 2024, Archaeologists from the University of South Carolina conducted an excavation there. What they found exceeded every expectation. Beneath the soil, where Ruth's cabin once stood, buried deliberately, they discovered a small collection of objects. Fragments of a clay bowl showing signs of long use for grinding herbs. Seeds from pokeweed and bloodroot, preserved inside a small clay container. And a piece of cloth, rotted almost to nothing, but still recognizable. The most significant find was a small stone figure, about 3 inches tall, carved in a style that originated in West Africa. It depicted a female form with exaggerated features symbolizing fertility and protection. Similar figures had been uncovered at enslaved people's sites across the South, suggesting that those who were enslaved had quietly maintained their connections to African spiritual tradition, in spite of every effort made to erase their culture. The archaeologists believed Ruth had buried these objects as a ritual, a way of preserving her identity and calling on something larger than herself to help in the work she was doing. Those artifacts from Ruth's cabin are now displayed at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. They are accompanied by the full story, drawn from her notebook and the years of research it inspired. Visitors can see the bowl she used to grind her herbs. They can see the seeds she collected. They can see the carved figures she inherited or made. And they can read her words, transcribed from the notebook that Patience wrote in 1881, telling the story of a woman who refused to accept her fate. The last member of the Whitmore family to carry Ruth's genetic legacy died in 1931. His name was Thomas Whitmore Blake. He was Margaret's grandson. He was 34 years old. Thomas had known about Ruth since he was a teenager. His grandmother had shown him the notebook and explained everything it meant for their family. He had spent his entire adult life knowing that his blood carried something he could not escape. In interviews given before his death, Thomas said he felt no anger toward Ruth. He said he understood why she had done what she did. His family had committed crimes against humanity for generations and had never once been held accountable. Ruth had simply provided the accountability that the legal system never would. He said he hoped his death would mark the end of something. He hoped that with the extinction of the Whitmore bloodline, some portion of the debt his ancestors had run up might finally be considered paid. He knew no amount of suffering could undo what had been done to Ruth and the millions like her. But he hoped their story might serve as a warning to every future generation about the true cost of treating other human beings as property. Thomas died without children. He had chosen not to have them, knowing he would pass his condition on. With his death, the direct bloodline of Edmund Whitmore came to its end. 189 years after Ruth had stood on that auction platform in Charleston. The curse was complete. But the story does not end with death. It ends with memory, with the determination of those who survived to make absolutely certain that what happened would never be forgotten. Ruth's descendants, traced through her son Joseph and her daughter Sarah, now number in the thousands. They hold reunions. They share photographs and documents and DNA results, piecing together the branches of a family tree that slavery tried its hardest to destroy. Every year on the anniversary of Ruth's death in 1881, they gather for a memorial service. They come from across the country, from big cities and small towns, from every walk of life. They read passages from her notebook. They sing songs passed down through generations. At the 2030 gathering near the site of Ryan's Mart in Charleston, the very building where Ruth had been sold, more than 300 of her descendants attended. They ranged in age from newborns to elders in their 90s, representing every shade of brown and black, a living, breathing testament to the resilience of a family that was never supposed to survive. Grace Williams, the woman who had first placed Ruth's notebook in Margaret's hands, was 92 years old by then, too frail to travel. But she sent a message that was read aloud to the gathering. She said that Ruth had taught her something important about the nature of justice. She said that justice is not always swift or visible. Sometimes it takes generations to arrive. Sometimes the people who most deserved it never lived to see it happen. But justice has its own timeline, and those who commit great wrongs should never assume they have escaped consequences simply because those consequences have been delayed. Ruth had been patient, Grace said. She had understood that her revenge would not be completed in her lifetime. She had accepted that she would never see the Whitmore family brought low. But she had trusted in the process she had started. She had trusted that the seeds she planted would eventually bear fruit. And they had. Every Whitmore who had suffered, every child who had never been born, every branch of that family tree that had withered and finally fallen, all of it. The harvest of seeds planted nearly 2 centuries before by one quiet, determined woman in a leaking cabin on a plantation called Magnolia. Ruth had not destroyed the Whitmore family. She had made them destroy themselves. She had turned their own greed and cruelty back against them. She had used the very system that oppressed her as the instrument of her revenge. And in doing so, she had demonstrated something that slaveholders had always feared but never admitted aloud. That the people they enslaved were not inferior, were not less intelligent, less capable, or less human. They were simply people who had been denied the opportunity to show what they could do. Ruth showed what she could do, and her legacy will live forever. In the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, among the Whitmore family papers, there is a letter written in 1865, just after the war ended. It was written by Henry Whitmore, Edmund's last surviving son, to a cousin in Virginia. He describes the state of Magnolia after the war, the freed people who had already begun leaving to build new lives elsewhere. But there is one passage that stands apart from the rest. Henry writes about a woman named Ruth, one of his father's slaves for many years. He says she left the plantation the moment the war ended, without saying goodbye, without taking any of the belongings she was offered. He says he always found Ruth strange, that she had a way of looking at people that made him deeply uncomfortable. He says he was not sorry to see her go. The letter was written decades before Henry's death, long before the Whitmore family began its long, quiet decline, long before anyone had any idea what Ruth had done. Henry had no way of knowing that the woman he found strange had already sealed his family's fate. He had no idea that Ruth's silent departure was not a retreat. It was a victory. She had finished her work. There was nothing left for her at Magnolia. The teas had been served. The seeds had been planted. The rest was simply a matter of time. Ruth walked away from Magnolia Plantation in the spring of 1865 and never looked back. She had arrived as property. She left as the author of her own destiny, carrying a secret that would outlive everyone who had ever tried to own her. 2. This is the story of Ruth. She was born into slavery and died a free woman. She lost 5 children to the auction block and lived long enough to hold her grandchildren in her arms. She possessed knowledge that her oppressors never suspected, and she used it to achieve a revenge that took nearly 200 years to fully unfold. She never wrote a book. She never gave a speech. She never led a rebellion. She never appeared in any newspaper or historical record during her lifetime. She was simply one of millions of enslaved people who lived, suffered, and died inside a system designed to erase their humanity. But she refused to be erased. She found a way to fight back. with the only weapons she had. And her fight outlasted every single person who thought they had conquered her. History is full of stories like Ruth's. Stories that were never written down because the people who lived them were not considered worth remembering. Every plantation in the South had its Ruth. Someone who resisted, in ways visible or invisible. Someone who held on to their dignity and their heritage against every force designed to strip it away. Most of those stories are lost forever, gone with the people who carried them. But every now and then, a story survives. A notebook is passed down through generations. An archaeologist digs in exactly the right place. A descendant decides the time has finally come to share what they know. And when that happens, we are reminded that history is not only the story of the powerful, it is also the story of those who were supposed to be forgotten, but refused to disappear. Ruth refused to disappear. And now, almost 2 centuries after her death, she is finally being seen, not as a victim, not as property, but as what she always was, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and courage, who faced the impossible and found a way to prevail. Her story is not a story of easy forgiveness. It does not tie itself up neatly with healing and reconciliation. It is a story of rage and patience, and an unshakable determination to make the guilty answer for what they had done. Whether that makes Ruth a hero, or something more complicated, is a question every person must answer for themselves. But what cannot be denied is that Ruth's story is true, that it matters, and that it deserves to be told. The Whitmore family thought they owned her. They were wrong.